Welcome to Contra Dogma. Contra Dogma means against dogma. We're going to be looking at some contradictions in the biblical text, problems, difficulties, if you don't like the word contradictions, but I don't think there is another word that I can use here. Maybe difficulties, but I would want to call them contradictions. We're going to be looking at a number of cases. Today's case is Ishmaelites and Midianites. We're going to be looking at a series of videos that deal with some of these contradictions or some of these difficulties. What is case one? We're going to look at the story of Joseph's brothers selling him into slavery. The Ishmaelites and the Midianites problem. Now, the story of Joseph's brothers selling him into slavery in Egypt is well known. To some extent, however, familiarity with the outlines of this story usually and can obscure the significant inconsistencies and outright contradictions in the narrative. Sometimes we know these stories so well, we know them too much, that we don't actually pay attention to what we are reading. We're not going to do that today. With this series, we're going to really read carefully and point out these significant inconsistencies and, if I might say, or if I may say rather, outright contradictions in the narrative. I must say that we're looking at this through the lens of critical scholarship and not theological or religious dogma. We will step back and read this text with fresh eyes, and you will realize just how problematic the narrative is as it stands. There are some aspects of this text, that is the Joseph's narrative, his sale into slavery. There are some aspects of the text that appear strange. Repetitions, awkward transitions, apparent gaps. I can argue that these that I've mentioned could plausibly be attributed to authorial style. Sometimes authors tend to do that. Repetitions, awkward transitions, apparent gaps. Yes, authors sometimes do that. There are, however, problems in the text that cannot be easily resolved. And those are the ones I'll be hanging my hat on with this series. So, we're going to look at the narrative presence and action of both Ishmaelites and Midianites in the sale of Joseph. Let's take a jab at it. Genesis 37, I'm going to be reading from verses 18. And they saw him from afar, and when he had not yet drawn near to them, they plotted against him to put him to death. So they said one to other, Behold, that dreamer is coming. So now, let us kill him, and we will cast him into one of the pits. And we will say, A wild beast devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams. But Reuben heard, and he saved him from their hands. And he said, Let us not deal him a deadly blow, And Reuben said to them, "Do not shed blood. Cast him into this pit, which is in the desert, but do not lay a hand upon him, in order to save him from their hands, to return him to his father." Now it came to pass, when Joseph came to his brothers, that they stripped Joseph of his shirt, of the fine woolen coat which was upon him. And they took him and cast him into the pit. Now the pit was empty, there was no water in it. And they sat down to eat a meal, and they lifted their eyes and saw, and behold, a caravan of Ishmaelites was coming from Gilead. Put that in your spirit, it's important. And their camels were carrying spices, balm, and lotus, going to take it down to Egypt. And Judah said to his brothers, "What is the gain if we slay our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites. But our hand shall not be upon him, for he is our brother, our flesh." And his brothers hearkened. So they wanted to sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites, because when they lifted up their eyes, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming. Verses 28. Then Midianite men, merchants, passed by, and they pulled and lifted Joseph from the pit. And they sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 silver pieces, and they brought Joseph to Egypt. So here is the Midianites who are selling Joseph to the Ishmaelites. Please note that. Put that in your spirit. Verses 29. And Reuben returned to the pit, and behold, Joseph was not in the pit. So he rent his garments, and he returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone. And where will I go?" And they took Joseph's coat, and they slaughtered a kid, and they dipped the coat in the blood. And they sent the fine woolen coat, and they brought it to their father, and they said, "We have found this. Now recognize whether it is your son's coat or not." He recognized it, and he said, "It is my son's coat. A wild beast has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn up." And Joseph rent his garments, and he put sackcloth on his loins, and he mourned for his son many days. And all his sons and all his daughters arose to console him, but he refused to be consoled, for he said, "Because I will descend on account of my son as a mourner to the grave." And his father wept for him. Verses 36. And the Midianites sold him to Egypt, to Potiphar. That's a little problematic. I thought it was the Ishmaelites who sold him to Egypt, to Potiphar, because that is what we just read. Let me bring it up. In verse 25, we are told a caravan of Ishmaelites was coming from Gilead. Verse 27, we are told, "Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites." This is Judah telling his brothers to sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites. Verse 28, we are told that the Midianite men, merchants, passed by, and they pulled and lifted Joseph from the pit, and they sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites. So the brothers wanted to sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites, but the Midianite men, these merchants, beat the brothers to it. The Midianite men pulled and lifted Joseph from the pit, and they sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 silver pieces. Verses 36, we expect to see that it was the Ishmaelites who the Midianites sold Joseph to. We expect them to be the ones selling Joseph to Egypt to Potiphar. But that is not what verses 36 tells us. Verses 36 tells us that it was the Midianites who sold Joseph to Egypt to Potiphar. So, according to the plain reading and meaning of the text, these two foreign groups are the source of great confusion. I mean, it's confusing. It's difficult. Should I say a contradiction? The Ishmaelite traders arrive on the scene first. Before the transaction of selling Joseph, which was proposed by Judah, could take place, the Midianite traders, merchants, passed by, and according to the plain reading of the text, they pulled Joseph from the pit. And it is the Midianites who sell him to the Ishmaelites. Now, the Ishmaelites, upon purchasing Joseph, brought him to Egypt. But this is contradicted by what follows at the end of chapters 36. And the Midianites sold him to Egypt to Potiphar. So, this is what we have. Let me list them. Midianites sold Joseph to Ishmaelites. That's what the text tells us. And then Ishmaelites brought Joseph to Egypt. That's what the text tells us. And then the text turns around and tells us that Midianites sold him to Egypt to Potiphar. I'm confused. Who did what? Now, as if this was not problem enough, Genesis 39 comes in and makes this even more complicated. When we read Genesis 39, this is what it tells us. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt to Potiphar, Pharaoh's chamberlain, chief of the slaughterers, an Egyptian man, purchased him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. What? This is what we have. Number 3 says that Midianites sold Joseph to Egypt to Potiphar. Number 4 also says Ishmaelites sold Joseph to Egypt to Potiphar. So which is which? You see the difficulty. You see the contradiction, the inconsistency in the narrative. I know some of you would say you can solve it. Well, from the earliest stages of biblical interpretation, interpreters have had to come to terms with these or this apparent contradictions and inconsistencies to the present. The unity of the text was never in question for pre-critical interpreters. The unity of the text wasn't in question, like it is now. So they were therefore forced to find ways to eliminate or otherwise explain away this narrative problem and others. Look carefully. I'm pointing this to you that this is a contradiction. It's an inconsistency, and attempts have been made to harmonize this. To explain it away. You know the book of Jubilees, the 2nd century BCE book of Jubilees. Look carefully at what the book of Jubilees does to the narrative. Jubilees chapters 34. Let's read verse 11. And they dealt treacherously with him and formed a plot against him to slay him. But changing their minds, they sold him to Ishmaelite merchants, and they brought him down into Egypt, and they sold him to Potiphar. What has the book of Jubilees done? In this book, the Midianites and the abduction of Joseph are removed from the story entirely. You know, if you can't solve it, just remove it. When we get to Josephus, in his retelling of this episode, as in the book of Jubilees, the brothers sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites, and they in turn sell him to Potiphar in Egypt, eliminating the Midianites as well. Another post-biblical text also does the same thing, eliminates the Midianites in trying to solve the contradiction or the inconsistency or the difficulties, however you want to put it. What I'm pointing out is that there is an issue in the narrative. So this post-biblical text, originally perhaps also like the book of Jubilees from the 2nd century BCE, called the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, tells us, that is reading from the Testament of Zebulon, the 6th son of Jacob and Leah, in chapter 2, this is what we read. For Simon and Gad came against Joseph to kill him. And he said unto them with tears, Pity me, my brethren. Have mercy upon the bowels of Jacob our father. Lay not upon me your hands to shed innocent blood, for I have not sinned against you. And if indeed I have sinned, with chastising chastise me, my brethren, but lay not upon me your hand, for the sake of Jacob our father. And as he spoke these words, wailing as he did so, I was unable to bear his lamentations, and began to weep. And my liver was poured out, and all the substance of my bowels was loosened. And I wept with Joseph, and my heart sounded, and the joints of my body trembled, and I was not able to stand. And when Joseph saw me weeping with him, and them coming against him to slay him, he fled behind me, beseeching them. But meanwhile Reuben arose and said, Come, my brethren, let us not slay him, but let us cast him into one of these dry pits, which our fathers digged, and found no water. For this cause Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh forbade what water should rise up in them, in order that Joseph should be preserved. Verses 9. And they did so until they sold him to the Ishmaelites. So here as well, in the testaments of the 12 patriarchs, in this post-biblical source, where the Joseph narrative is mentioned, it also has the Ishmaelites alone, eliminating the Midianites. In this same testament of the 12 patriarchs, in the testament of Joseph, the 11th son of Jacob and Rachel, chapter 10, this is what we read. I'm going to read from verses 5. My brethren knew how my father loved me, and yet I did not exalt myself in my mind. Although I was a child, I had the fear of God in my heart, for I knew that all things would pass away. And I did nor raise myself against them with evil intent, but I honored my brethren, and out of respect for them, even when I was being sold, I refrained from telling the Ishmaelites that I was the son of Jacob, a great man and a mighty. Again, the Midianites are not mentioned. They have been eliminated. There is an issue, there is a contradiction, there is some inconsistency, and this is how it's being solved. This is how it's being resolved. Eliminating the Midianites. What we have seen so far is the retelling of the biblical story by these early interpreters in one way or another, reshaping the narrative slightly and eliminating the problem of the Ishmaelites and Midianites. That's what is being done. The story is being retold. The story has been reshaped. And in this retold, reshaped narrative, the problem has been eliminated. You take away the Midianites, you solve the problem. But the Midianites are there. Now, in later generations, which we'll see in part 2, in the rabbinic sources, the simple removal of unwanted elements from the biblical text was no longer feasible. You cannot just remove stuff. New ways of interpreting away the contradiction had to be developed. And we'll look at the main rabbis and how they try to solve this contradiction. Stay tuned. My name is Rabbi Akwetey Amaah. Contra, Dogma.